Welcome back, armchair generals and railway enthusiasts. This is Gamer 1745 here with my good friend, the new IKB. Say hi, IKB.
Hello, everyone.
And we're going to be playing Railway Empire, talking about the developments of railway in Britain, of course, as you know from this current segment. And we're going to be pushing out to Bath now. And IKB has been telling me a bit about it, but I know he has more to say about Railway Mania, which happened more in the 1840, but we pushed the goals we're playing so well 5 years early. So why don't you start telling us a bit about that while I work on the putting together this train system.
So the Railway Mania is, you could, to call it a bubble would probably be, call it a bubble, a financial bubble would be wrong, because there's actual things, physical things actually come out of it in terms of, track being laid and such. But it could definitely be seen as a massive boom in railway construction and people being interested in railways as a place to put their investments. And what really starts this off is that in 1825, the government repeals the Bubble Act that was a holdover from the disastrous South Sea bubble of the 1720s. And
well, there were several. Just mentioning that, I'm going to have to interrupt you here. I'm going to start over on this. You have there were various trading companies, shall we say, and one of them that was sort of a bubble that burst was the Darien Company. And that was done by Scotland. Now, Scotland at the time had the same monarch as Britain, but was otherwise it was before the Act of Union with England. We said same monarch as Britain. Well, yeah, it was Britain because it was Ireland and Wales as well as England, but had the same monarch, but otherwise an entirely, and I mean entirely different navy, army, entirely different structure, and it was the sort of bursting of the Darien Company that bankrupt so much of the Scottish establishment, the elites. Excuse me. And whether they be titled lords or whatever, or just other wealthy people, but of them that basically sort of willing to bail them out for it if they were to support the union with England. So that is how Scotland gets into in that time period in the early 1700s, gets into the Act of Union, which is in 1707. So a little before your 1720s there, but just sort of how much that can affect the change of nations. But you can go on with what you're saying.
And so this Bubble Act had limited the number of individual investors in any joint stock company to a maximum of 5. So this naturally meant that the first railways, such as the Manchester and Liverpool and such, had a very small pool of very wealthy investors, titled lords who had old money, businessmen who had earned an awful lot of money, and such like. And so this naturally kept the potential amount of this naturally sort of presented a bit of a limit on how much money they could actually get.
Yeah.
Because, a small number of very rich people still don't have as much money as a very large number of not quite as rich people.
Right.
So,
and also I will say that if people are being wise about it, a lot of people say if they're being wise about it, puts 10 or 20% of their investment capital into a particular company, where if you're really rich, are you going to put all of your capital into the railroad, even if if you had it to put in there, or are you just only going to put in 10 or 20%? So that does limit the amount that you're going to put into it. But if you have so many people putting in a small percentage of their investment capital, can really still be much safer for everyone involved,
Yes.
and that's a major factor there.
And the one other thing that really set it off was that the Bank of England in the mid 1840s, basically they decided to cut the interest rate to try and encourage more industrial growth, to try and encourage more basically make investing in private enterprise more profitable and seem like a better, more attractive investment than investing in, say, government bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets the ball rolling a bit because suddenly, people of the middling sort start thinking, oh, I've got a little bit of money here. Let's invest some of this in some of these new railway companies because they seem to be doing well. And
Mm-hmm.
then this starts to build up, and you know, people, there's really quite high returns of investment coming from these things, and so
Mm-hmm.
suddenly everyone starts looking, hang on, these railways are making money hand over fist, then it very quickly gets the idea of any company that bears the title of railway in some respect suddenly starts to attract rather a lot of investment.
Right.
And some of these companies are, legitimate attempts to build railways between places. Others are attempts to build railways between places that really have no business at this time having a railway being built between them because they're, places that don't particularly have a huge amount of potential traffic, but you know might do with the sort of the idea being if we build a rail, build it and they will come. If we build this
Right.
railway, then traffic will materialize from
Mm-hmm.
you know suddenly it being possible to make more use of the local farmland because we could
Yeah, but they're still
slow
they're
enough
still they're still
moving.
doing that today because that's what they said about the railway, high speed railway between L.A. and San Francisco, which is entirely unnecessary. No one would actually write it, but yeah, go
Yeah.
on.
And then there's sort of the bottom tier of schemes that are obviously out and out scams, but you know, at this time, this is before the internet. It's not easy to find out, even within the United Kingdom, you know, exactly where all of these little villages are. And there's even within the UK, there's an awful lot of villages that have either the same or very similar sounding names. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can quite easily see people getting a bit confused about where things are. And so people start making, an awful lot of money on these things, and new railway companies start springing up everywhere to the point where there gets to be at its height almost 150 of them in a small island that's about 200 by 500 miles. It gets a bit crazy, and of course Parliament's view on all this is very much laissez-faire. And Parliament's view on this is, well, if there's going to, be, railways built, well, how are we going to decide who's got the best railway? Well, we'll let a competitor open up a competing route, and whoever makes the most money can get will be the one who survives, and make it very much survival of the fittest. You know,
Mm-hmm.
out and out laissez-faire, capitalism rep war, and then it starts a bit of a bubble because people
Mm-hmm.
start to realize, there starts to suddenly be an awful lot of You start seeing the start of sort of modern stock market things with people, newspaper ads and things like that, advertising railway shares, and then things, people start advertising the fact that you can purchase these shares with a 10% deposit and then pay off the
Ah,
remainder with part of the dividend.
yes, yes. That is bad, of
That's
course.
where things start to go a little bit crazy
Right.
because, of course, Parliament have basically no restrictions on where you can build. All you have to do is get a bill through Parliament, which very quickly turns into a game of how many MPs can we bribe. And considering some of them are probably also some of those MPs are probably also investors in your company, they're naturally inclined to vote in favour of it.
Hmm.
Things start to get a little out of hand, and of course, there's the deadline for every year for when plans must be submitted by to be considered for being put through Parliament that year, and so this leads to all sorts of shenanigans of rival companies literally getting into fist fights trying to stop the others getting their plans to work into London to be put before Parliament. One railway company even go as far as staging a fake funeral and hiding the plans in the coffin, because of course this is an age before computers and CAD files and anything like that. So we're talking about massive long, all the surveys on massive long maps that
Right.
are
I can.
rolled up like giant Persian carpets.
Right.
And you then have to unravel and look over to see, where the line's going in different places and where these bridges are going to be. And, you know, and things start to spiral up and up and up. And it gets to about 1845, and suddenly, the bubble basically bursts because far too many people have invested far too much money that they can't afford because, again, people have sunk their entire savings into this, and they've sunk their entire savings into buying the 10% deposits,
Right.
having thought that, it's a railway, it can only make profit. It's, they literally see these things as being money printing machines, essentially.
Well,
And
they can be.
they can be, but at this point, everyone it is very much like the .com boom of the early 90s, where
Right.
it's if you replace .com with railway, basically the same things happen. There are some companies that that do well and survive and actually have reason to be, and there are others that end up basically blowing through their cash just getting built, and then immediately get brought up by other companies. And then you have 1845, the Bank of England decides to put up interest rates, so people suddenly start to invest in things like government bonds again, and then the share prices of the railway still start to slowly level out and things try to return to sanity. But then, of course, suddenly all of these investments suddenly sort of stop overnight because suddenly, the share prices are no longer going continuously up and up and up. So it starts to look less like a get rich quick scheme, and people start to go, how do I'm going to lose all my money. So people suddenly start selling their shares, which of course crashes the market. And so, of course, the railways thinking, oh my God, we're going to lose our source of incoming capital to finance construction and such, start calling in the basically saying that all of these shares that have been bought on the 10% deposit are, of course, all brought with the contract you sign when you buy them, saying that the railway company has the right to call in the remainder at any time. and the railways call in the remainder in bulk.
Right.
And there are people who end up in the poorhouse because of this, who literally, there are some middle class families who literally their entire savings disappear completely overnight.
As soon
And
as
there
you,
are
yeah, go
there
on.
are tales of people being found who have committed suicide with their pockets stuffed full of now worthless railway share certificates.
Right. And as soon as you started mentioning buying things on the margin, that is a bad situation. Yeah, that really is.
On the list of things you just don't do.
Yes, and I firmly believe that, as like you say, is a list of things you don't do. And just for whoever who's maybe young and haven't heard this advice, don't put all of your wealth into one investment, no matter how good it appears to be. It is a very bad idea, because I very well may put, I don't know, 20% or 10 or 20% of my wealth into an investment that looks to be 100%, but and is going to pay off really well. But I am not going to put more than that, no matter how good it looks, because it is just too potentially full of problems. So don't, like I said, if you do it responsibly, investing in a lot of money-making options are good, and sharing out that risk. Well, hey, you lose 10% of your investment capital money. Whether that means I've got $10 to invest in a thing, that means you can invest $1 in it. Doesn't mean 10% of your money or your wealth, because maybe it's your house and other things. But if you have investment capital, money to put into investment, sure, fine, good. You can put 10, maybe 20% into one thing, but no matter how good it is, don't do more than that as just general advice on the subject.
And now, the one thing that should be noted is that out of this, unlike some stock market bubbles, there was actually a sort of net tangible result from all the investment. There was actually a massive expansion in the British railway system. The amount of track mileages goes up.
Have you really not got the message that your station has no future here?
Right. Oh, even if it is, because if the plan is not a complete swindle, a lot of the investment can go into things like rights of way for buying property up, and other elements that can be recouped if the overall investment collapses, compared to ephemeral.com kind of things that maybe nothing is left around afterwards. So it's not, like you say, the worst possible situation investing. Right now, IKB and I had planned a little bit what to do, but I'm changing it because I saw a competitor come into Carlisle, and I wanted to make sure I could get a station up there. So we're
so now we are building the Settle to Carlisle.
Yes.
And which is another one of those very famous railway routes in the UK that has some very nice big viaducts on. So if you like that sort of thing, definitely worth heading up there to have a look. Yes. And so one of the sort of secondary results from the sort of collapse of this bubble is that a lot of the many smaller railway companies that suddenly are left without any funding or anything start getting brought up by some of the larger ones, And so larger companies like the Great Western Railway that runs from London through Swindon, Bath and out to Bristol, and what eventually becomes the Midland Railway start to buy up these sort of failed or sort of functionally bankrupt lines to essentially start building their own empires and building their own networks, because they can then get these, they can buy up these lines and suddenly, okay, yes, we've got to pay for it, but we're paying a fraction of what it would have been to actually build it ourselves because someone else has already done that, and we're buying it and we've immediately got it. We can immediately, yes, we might have to lay a few miles of track and sidings to get things properly connected up to our network, but this is where these sort of railway empires start to grow and start to be start to become, instead of being loads and loads of separate companies trying to compete with each other, they start to grow into a more integrated network, and you start to get people actually thinking more in terms of a network rather than rather than it being sort of competing direct routes.
Well, competing direct routes, or just simply a railway between two locations. That even if there's only one out there, it networks together, because that is quite honestly truly the beauty of the system, is once it can network. Britain eventually, of course, I'm just letting everybody else know that, and they've gone through different phases. IKB, of course, knows this better than I do. They eventually, basically nationalize it and put it under a single system. That has problems, in my opinion. What America did after a while is force all the railways to accept traffic, competitors' traffic on their railroads, but and pay. I don't know how the fees were set, but pay a mileage fee, so that you would make money off of your competitors running trains on your railroads. But this gets rid of the desire for redundancy in systems, because you can have your primary, connections between cities in certain areas, but your trains run all over, America or wherever they want to go, and similarly other places. So that way you get maximum profits for the maintenance costs, shall we say, for the infrastructure for your railroad areas, and there's not two sets of railroads between a city or between a mine and a town or whatever. That really does better. You can talk better on how it should be in Britain, whether it should be a unified national system or competing systems, and how if can competition be done in Britain for railways? I don't know.
Now that raises the interesting question of, when is duplication, and when is duplication something that might look like duplication but might actually potentially have the possibility of serving two separate shall we say, markets in such a way. So if we take an example of on our network we're building here, if you've got a railway line that's heading from, say, Manchester down to London, if we then sort of move over to, if one line goes sort of, shall we say, takes a more southerly route, more direct south route, and goes through, say, Swindon, even though we don't have that modelled here, and another one of those lines, say, goes through Oxford to get to London, would those lines really be duplicated? Because one of those lines serves Swindon and the other one serves Oxford. So
right.
It's the idea of, okay, a direct express service that, say, London to Manchester Express train that you've got two trains competing, that are basically running non-stop expresses. Those two trains would be in competition, but the regular sort of stopping service that would stop at the intermediate station, is that really in competition with? Are those really in competition with each other? Because for a lot of their route, they're picking up people from towns and cities that the other railway line doesn't go anywhere near and doesn't have a way of accessing those markets, which raises the interesting question of when is duplication duplication?
Just rolled towards me.
Right. Yeah.
And so because if you were to say that one of those railway lines was duplication and say, okay, we're going to get rid of it, then whichever one you then decide to stop using and pull up all the track for, well, suddenly you've cut yourself off from one of those two alternative sources of one of the two alternative markets, be that Swindon, which we unfortunately don't have on this map but really should, or Oxford. So it gives you another sense of when is duplication really duplication?
Yeah. Let's see. This is Bath to Southampton. Okay, we're going to let's get rid of this out. Well, hopefully, this was due to popping out the train station there, and it reset a few things.
So now we now have the Great Western Main Line, so Brunel's baby, so to speak.
Up
also
through
known
here.
as, we've got up through there. We've got the West Coast Main Line heading up from this and turning into the set on Carlisle, heading up to Carlisle. And hopefully from there we can punch on across towards Edinburgh and Glasgow.
Right, and so because of my inner railway baron here, and I want to make sure that I put the railway station the way I want it in Edinburgh. Let's see about this here. That looks fairly good. And then we're going to come, well, that will split off that way, so this will be, okay. Come through the border country.
Yes, because I'd say we are possibly building across some of the area that will be covered by the Scottish Borders Railway, which is one that was closed down and is now being, part of it at least has been reopened as part of the national network, and they are very much looking at fully reopening the line all the way through.
Well, there's problems with railways. Is that they require a lot of maintenance. Well, I mean, roads require maintenance. Well, unless you're a Roman road, then if you actually know how to build roads, you don't need that much maintenance on them. They should still function to the day. The amount of maintenance you have to put on a railway to keep it going at all is considerable. Where a roadway, if no one's driving on it, then there's not a lot of maintenance needed for it because it doesn't have the wear and tear on it.
The one thing I must always say from my day job of actually maintaining the track on a railway is that, my God, it would be so much easier if the trains never ran. Because
if the trains what?
If the trains never moved, the job would be so much easier.
Right, and so the sort of the amount of because there's so much to deal with infrastructurally, not just on the rails themselves, but maintaining the train stations, running the train. Meaning, at some point, moving a train from Edinburgh to Carlisle, if there's only 4 people on that particular train, I mean, there may be 1,000 people on the train in the morning and the evening, but in like the middle of the afternoon, there's only 4 people in that train. It isn't worth moving the train because of the people on the train, that need to, on the actual train itself and run it and maintain it and clean and all of that. So it isn't worth operating, where if it's just a regular road, and whether it's people driving their own cars or if you use buses or something, it's more dynamic. So if it's not in use at a particular time, it's not. And so, like your earlier example of when is it duplication and when is it traveling along the same path but serving different needs, the way you do it is you shut down one without tearing it all up and let it run for a while to see, can the sort of single thing modify and handle the amount of traffic that you need appropriately or not, kind of thing. And that's what I think is sometimes missing in some of the railway situations.
Yes, it's the railways. You can mothball railway tracks quite well, and
Right.
especially if as long as it doesn't get too overgrown with big trees that are going to seriously disrupt the foundations and stuff. It's not small weeds in the forefoot aren't the end of the world.
Right, and also, and you've talked about this, how when they've gotten rid of some of the railway systems around, that they then turn the property over to like housing development or other things, as opposed to simply just letting the system go fallow and keeping the rights of way clear, so that if you want to, in essence, maybe start from scratch but build along the same route, you can at least keep that there. And they haven't done that apparently as much as they probably should have in many cases.
Yes, and there's a lot of the railways in the United Kingdom get a bit strange, because you get after the railway mania and things start to sort of calm down and consolidate, you get these relatively large empires forming, such as the Great Western and the Midland, who sort of buy up some of these older lines that aren't quite as these sort of start buying up these lines that were less financially stable on their own, but that become vital once integrated into part of a complete network. And from there they start that's sort of what really it's about 1922, after World War One, that gets properly consolidated, where the government basically forces a series of mergers to create the big 4 railway companies, essentially, where you have the GWR, who is the only one that comes through it with its original name intact, because it's the GWR, essentially, and no one really wants to mess with what is sometimes referred to as God's Wonderful Railway. The Midland ends up grabbing some other bits and becomes the London, Midland and Scottish. Around the sort of south of London, covering the east along to sort of Bournemouth and Poole area, and then sort of heading towards Exeter, and then crossing to the north side of the Cornish Peninsula, you've got the Southern Railway, and then basically the northeast from London up to Scotland becomes the London North Eastern Railway. And in that state there is an awful lot of competition in terms of there's a little bit of competition in terms of who's got the fastest trains, which runs for a bit before people start deciding this isn't safe, and we're going at 100 miles per hour plus over jointed track and point work very quickly racks up a huge bill in terms of crockery that gets smashed in the restaurant car. So
I can imagine, yeah.
So that they sort of pull back from sort of competing on speed record terms and sort of more focus in terms of competing on terms of actual speeds that are deliverable in terms of running sort of an actual sensible service at the time, and they start to focus very much on things like luxury and comfort, and you start getting things like the main sort of the Flying Scotsman Express, which isn't always hauled by the locomotive, the Flying Scotsman. There's the locomotive, and then there's the named train. They're two separate things, but sometimes the Flying Scotsman would pull the Flying Scotsman, but other times it would be a different locomotive. The point that I must make, because some people confuse the two, it's not your fault. But they then, some of those trains end up having a carriage that's got a cinema in it for showing films. As a way of competing and showing, look what amazing new technology we've got. And this sort of
as well as just new technology then, but also, hey, you won't be so bored while you're on the train.
Bored while you're sat on your train, you'll have something to do other than read a book, and you get similar things with people. This sort of carries on till about till the end of the 1930s, and it's really World War II that sort of puts a sock in it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, if World War II had either not happened or had been over and done with much faster, without the British railway system being essentially run ragged to keep up with the demands of the war effort, then the Big Four would probably have stayed around until today, in all actuality, because they were doing a reasonably good job of things.
I don't think I don't think a lot of Britons today know just how, let alone everybody else, how much World War II exhausted Britain. Britain was on the winning side, but it did not win the war.
No, we didn't.
It's in any sort of sense of it. They were on the winning side. They survived the war just barely, but that's how I would put it.
Yes,
as survival.
It was very much survived, especially in terms of the railway network. They're down to huge amounts of deferred track maintenance, to the point where it's not until the 50s that you start seeing. It's not until the 50s that you start seeing trains being able to match their pre-war timings for high-speed express services.
Yeah, and it wasn't. I think it was the 50s is when they also finally got rid of rationing.
Yes.
That was 10 or 15 years after the war was over. They're finally getting rid of rationing in Britain.
Yes. And that's when you start getting things like even things like building new locomotives. They have to go through, even after the war, they have to go through the Ministry of Supply to get hold of steel to build new locomotives.
Right.
And they have to be able to justify, yes, we need these to keep things rolling.
And so, yeah, I would put a lot of today's problems in Britain to the exhaustion of World War II. I don't think people realize how much history affects them to this day like that. I just don't think they do.
And there's the eternal, to be honest, after the war, the railways, which had been sort of nationalised during the war, essentially,
right,
to manage everything, and they'd sort of, the railways had sort of understood and known that, yeah, there's a war on, we're now under nominal government control, and we're basically saying, yes, we'll say what you want, we'll do what you want, because there's a war on, things have got to be done. They then, after the war, they are in such a state that they basically have to be kept nationalized, because if you gave them back to the private companies immediately, then there would have been, those private companies would have blown through whatever cash reserves they may or may not have had on just catching up with the deferred maintenance. So you would have, it's at the point where it's and especially because it's a post-war Labour government who are very pro-nationalisation and are in some ways a little bit blinded by sort of socialist dogma of their strange belief that we can nationalise everything and run it as a completely integrated system of not just the railways but road and sea and canal transport as well. And that never works out properly, because it doesn't, and because of the the sheer level of additional complexity it adds on top, there's no way it could ever have worked. And that's what really drives the end of the had, and of course it's only post-war, I think it's not until like I think even the early 60s that they actually repeal some of the sort of common carriage laws from back when the railways were a flat-out monopoly, and allow them to straight out compete in the open market and charge the actual going rate for the carriage of goods. Because a lot of things like coal and stuff, there was there was essentially a case of, because around this time period especially, the railways have an essential monopoly because it's the only real way of transporting stuff at any meaningful quantity at any meaningful speed or distance. There is legislation put in place basically saying, look, there's you're not allowed to say you're not going to transport something or to charge a ridiculous price for the cost of transporting it for your own reasons, because you're trying to drive a certain coal mine out of business because you favour its competitor for some reason.
Right.
It's rules like that when the railways were an actual monopoly made sense. But once you get into especially the post-World War II environment, where the market is flooded with surplus army lorries, and where the world wars have massively pushed forward the development in terms of the automotive industry, in terms of getting more efficient engines for cars and trucks, and has massively basically set up essentially almost ready to go civilian airports everywhere from all of the old RAF bases. Suddenly the railways find themselves in a position where they have to compete with all of these new competitors, and at the same time they've just been nationalised by a Labour government that has designs on trying to somehow nationalise, they sort of semi-do nationalise the road transport industry in a sort of weird way of stuff that's going over a certain distance or stuff becomes part of this strange British road transport nationalised thing, which just should never
okay, to me that sounds horrific, and I mean that literally. It is horrific. I did not know that the Labour government tried to nationalize trucking. I definitely knew that they were on the railway binge and the healthcare binge and all of that. I want communists and socialists and others to watch my channel. I definitely, you're welcome here. I want you here. I think you're all wrong about things, but I want you here. And if you are enough of a thinking person, you should want to have your assumptions challenged here. So it's a friendly place in that we and IKB and many of the other people that do contribute, like the War Thunder playing team and others, contribute to this channel. We want you here, but please understand that your ideology is not, at least most of us that participate in this channel's ideology. And here is the problem, and here is why what IKB is horrific. Okay, that may be slightly overstating it if you compare it to, you know, in The Final Solution in Germany or something like that, or the gulags or whatever, or the Uyghur camps today in China. It isn't to that scale, but what is really bad about nationalization and when you even have, you know, if you, whether it's socialism or otherwise, because it can even happen under fascism with private ownership of, say, the railways or the boot factory or whatever it may be. But once you get it into government administration type thing, like, hey, yeah, you can have that factory, you get to, you know, make boots, you can, you know, you'll make boots, and you get the boots will cost $8 to make, and you can sell them for $10 to, you know, whatever. So you're making a 20% profit over your cost. Oh, and you get to make 10,000 pairs of boots a month. Don't make any less, you know, because we need to have 10,000 pairs of boots a month. But don't make any more, because that factory in that other town is also going to be making 10,000 pairs of boots, and we're going to rationalize production. And that can happen under fascism. That is sort of my understanding. And I know there's competing, even back under Mussolini, there's competing definitions of fascism. A lot of people call things fascism when it isn't. Now, they may be fascistic, meaning having characteristics of fascism, without being fascism. But that is my understanding of how fascism is supposed to work in a general, is a central planning way in which, yes, individuals in a way get to own the means of production, but it is managed by the state, which if we jump over to more socialism, in which the means of production is owned collectively by the people, controlled by the state. So that's sort of some of the differences there. And you need, for things to work well, you need competition. I don't care. I mean, that is just a fact. For things to work well, you need competition. Why? This is me pontificating here, and because what you need is comparatives. One of the things that's often said in America is the government can't run anything well except for the army. That's the only thing they can run well, because look at wherever you try to run something else, it runs poorly. Well, who says that the government can run an army well? Just because we don't have private armies that, you know, that are maybe could be fight better, privatize the armies, you know. And I don't mean random mercenaries. I mean, hey, you there, you get to have a division. You get to organize up the division, hire and train the troops. They're only going to fight for our country, but we'll pay you, you know, $1 million a month to keep that division going. And maybe that guy can have a great division for only paying costing $200,000 a month. We don't know that. Now, I'm not suggesting that we really want to go to privatized divisions like they did in the 18th century and before. They used to do that. You actually owned the regiment. You got money every year, basically, from the government to maintain a regiment. You had to, they would come and check and make sure the regiment was properly equipped, but that was normally handled by bribes. So because it wasn't, And they would, of course, have to get enough troops and enough muskets and uniforms when you're actually going to go to war. Now, Britain had the luxury of, because they didn't privatize their navy. They had, an island and were, protected by their fleets so that they could spool up their armies to actually function. But yeah, in the 18th century and before, they did have more somewhat privatized armies. Not quite, but an individual owned a regiment, basically. And that you actually bought the commission for the regiment, and they paid you money and whatnot. Okay, so you need competition because you need comparative choices. Is the railway run well or not? Is it run safely or not? Is it run efficiently? Is it run cost effectively or not? You need a comparative element to have it run right, because otherwise you don't know if it's running well. You have also, without competition, whether it's on an individual scale, if say I'm running around a track, I'm running around a track, I must be going fast. I'm going fast. Without competition, if somebody to compare that to, is he or she running faster or slower than I am? That is why we have sport and competition, to drive us to run a bit faster. I may never be able to catch that really fast person, but it shows me I should try harder. Okay, and this should show whether on an individual basis, of a person working within a company or as companies, they need to have a competition. So now railways, because of their primary inherent limitation of running on tracks, you can't have someone owning the left track and another company owning the right track. It has to be, and I mean within a single railway, not just back and forth here. You have to have a sort of somewhat unified system. But as IKB was bringing up, the flowering of commercial trucking in Britain after World War II is a competitive element to the railroad. Is it best to have, outside of this cider, I don't know what cider maker, I guess, I don't know, is that a brewery or what would you call a cider maker? But outside, is it best to have the train come up next to this factory and unload right into the factory? Or is it best to have just trucks show up to that factory? How many deliveries a day, a week, a month, a year, and to the factory and then shipping out? Is the shipping out of the factory big, huge orders from Hull going down to London, or is it shipping to 20 different pubs around Hull, or 20 different pubs in 20 different cities, but each pub only wants half a truckload, and a truck can drop at two locations and then turn around, come home, and trying to put that necessarily all the extra hassle of putting it on trains and getting off trains, getting it to the local pub, all of that stuff becomes too much. That maybe it's best to actually have truck delivery, because the truck even is full and it's going over to Leeds full, but it can stop outside of 20 different pubs or whatever and deliver its cider and then head home. Maybe empty. Maybe if it's an outside shipping company, maybe there's a similar load of stuff going back to Hull. Maybe not. But infrastructurally, it's a competitive element, and so you need competition to have comparative look at anything, whether it's comparative on the end results or comparative on how reliably does a shipment of cider get there. Of course, there's traffic accidents happen out there. How often does a cider truck spill all of its cider versus the safety maybe of a railway delivery of your cider? You need a comparative element, and this is and now most people aren't out there advocating for, and I just see another city they got to, so we need to expand out here just to keep them from growing. but that will be for the next episode. So you need the, but a lot of people on this day and age talk about leftist ideologies, if we will, socialism, communism. They all believe that these are good goals. For various reasons, often some of them might come down to, quote unquote, fairness, but they are inherently I don't know if corrosive or, well, they probably are corrosive. They are inherently bad for the human condition. So they are evil. And so you don't ever want to do a socialistic because monopolies. You also, IKB also was mentioning, the idea of, sort of total control over something. You don't want that either. And so capitalism is a term that's often abused by the left, and the left doesn't understand it very well. And if you're talking about state capitalism, which can sometimes look like fascism, but if you're talking about, or often the term is sort of used as crony capitalism, can be a bad thing. When most of us talk about capitalism, we need to add one or two words to it, basically free market capitalism. And so when IKB was talking about the bubble and with the railways out there and how everybody was out there and Parliament wasn't really caring about the details of the situation, just go ahead and do it. Well, so long as it is a free market, and that as an inherent element of a free market is that you don't have companies saying undercharging for transportation on, and the government needs to watch this, on their railway to put the other railway out of business. There are laws in the U.S. against that kind of stuff. So that you need to have this free market, you need to have that competition. So if ever a company like, I don't know, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, we could probably think of a few other names, becomes a de facto monopoly, even, they only control 90%, they're still a competitor. Yeah, no. Probably none of these companies should control more than 40% of, say, search results. How you limit it, I don't know. But you need that competitive element. Is Google the best search engine? Well, right now, I'm absolutely sure it is, just on its technology. But if it doesn't have competition out there, it can become I don't know, atrophied or arthritic, in that it's it doesn't continue to push itself because it doesn't have a competitor pushing it better, intelligent search engines and similar sort of technology and capabilities. So governments need to make, I am for free market. I am for the idea of sort of laissez-faire capitalism with, safety standards. We don't want sour milk or milk with some sort of poisonous additive because it makes it whiter or something. China, that was one of their situations there with powdered milk, and other sorts of things. You want some levels of regulation, and you want to keep anybody from becoming either, whether it's a local monopoly or a national monopoly. You need to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, I do know we're going to have local monopolies, whether it's a government-owned water company that supplies water to your house, or whether it's a private-owned water company that supplies water to your house. You don't really want 3 different sets of pipes coming to your house that you get to choose which hooks up to, because that's just over redundancy. So there will be monopolies, but they need to be highly regulated and they need to be observed. And the way you get competition or comparative results is to not have one for the nation. I don't know how Britain's water situation works, But in America, obviously, there's many water companies, and we can see how badly, like Flint, Michigan, in which the water is basically almost unusable to clean things with, let alone to drink, because of government decisions to go for cheaper stuff because, hey, it was cheaper, and I'm sure people got bribes in the city council and whatnot. But is the comparative results of different cities and how their water is being handled, and that can be a comparative system to see, does it cost more in LA? Well, very well it might, because LA is almost a desert here, and we bring in water from great distances here to supply it, compared to, say, somewhere on the East Coast where there's lots of rain, of America, where there's lots of rain, and all you got to do is make sure you have a reasonable amount of reservoirs. You're going to catch it, and it's going to be local. You don't have to, transport it long distances. And I'm talking hundreds of miles that there's aqueducts coming to LA to get it. That's not enough water currently. So, so you can very well see that water may be more expensive in LA versus South Carolina or someplace. But you can see the reasons why there's difference there, and understand them. So socialism, nationalization, centralization, however you want to do with that, for whatever ideology you're looking for, is a terrible way, just the worst way you can organize up a system. And so, yes, railways are cool. I like them, but you'll often see him on the live chats and commenting below. No Need, who is from Africa, really thinks, and I would agree with him, that they need to build much more rail systems in Africa, and that would be a wondrous thing. But probably in most of the developed world, we don't need lots of new rail systems. As IKB will say, yeah, well, here they need to reactivate some lines here and there. Absolutely. I'm not against that idea. But the idea of America doing, well, most of our rail systems needs to be rebuilt because it's out of date and worn out and needs to be improved. But building new rail systems is probably, of any real scale, is not the way to go in America. It's maintaining their currents, because we do have a rather good one here, reaching major towns and major areas. And I'm sure, yeah, if you figure out a new mining deposit, sure, yeah, build a railway from that mine to the major network. I'm not arguing against zero expansion, but we don't need big new routes. We don't need to do big new things because of its, it's literally you're railroaded. You're literally, as the sort of the term is used, and that is a extremely negative element of railways. For all of their positives, for all of their good uses, there is that limitation where air travel, because just think if somehow we got efficient conversion, separation of oxygen and hydrogen from water, so we could put hydrogen fueled airplanes, and if we could build them out of fairly durable materials fairly cheaply, because the real biggest expense with air travel is the fuel cost. But if you can make the fuel cost almost nothing, how much better would it be to have a bunch of aircraft flying stuff around where and when you need it? Well, it may fall into your house, yes, when an airplane crashes, but it, an efficient air freight system that, and of course, for all you green people, hydrogen burns without any emissions. It's 100% green. So, and that would be, you could have, dynamically, as day by day, hour by hour, year by year, as needs change, you could air freight major, wheat, just wheat, something, bulk cheap that way. That could happen and would be better than limiting yourself to the railroads. When are we going to get to that level of technology? I have no clue, but that would obviously make, in many cases, not remove railroads, but limit their effectiveness. That's why sea shipping, as opposed to rail shipping, is so good because it is like the air in that you can, redirect your ships as needed, and that's why always shipping via sea, except for the speed element, is better than railway. And so either because coming around England, would take longer to get from Southampton to Bath. So it's better to go via railways because it's a long ways around. But if you're talking roughly equal distance, it's better to take shipping unless its speed is of the essence. But they can bulk up with modern freighters and overcome the time lag, because time is money in shipping. But if you can carry so much stuff on one ship, it's better. So that's sort of the limitations and the goodness of railroads both, but we have to keep IKB. If you like, you can comment on any of what I was saying, IKB.
Well, I was going to let you finish.
Well, I'm basically, yeah.
Yes. The one thing I can sort of say is that post-World War II, the railways, I think, should probably have stayed nationalised under the provisions they were nationalised under the war effort, and as part of the war effort. They should probably have stayed nationalised under that for a few years, till with presumably as much government investment being put into getting the track and such back into a fit and usable state as possible, with the idea being that, okay, this is nationalised only until we have got the track, the deferred maintenance on track and stuff caught up with, because that's something that can actually be measured, and it is, if you want to know when the maintenance has been caught up with, you ask the civil engineering department, and they will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And that if it had been a case of either that or having essentially huge low or basically no interest government loans that are basically, here's a load of money to pay off all the damages from the war effort and such like, so that they could actually recover. Because the one problem with nationalising them, especially with the sort of crazy Labour government's plan to also nationalise the trucking industry in the UK, along with basically all other forms of transportation, is that suddenly the railways, okay, we're all one big railway now, and the government is harping on about nationalising the roads. Okay, so there's not going to be any competition, so we don't need to worry about that sort of thing. And it's a result that's, I think, where they really start to go downhill, because they stop shooting for prestige things so much. You can even tell it in locomotive design after the war. They finish off building some of the old designs, but they don't do any of the crazy flamboyant stuff anymore. You don't get any more streamlined locomotives built in the UK, because it's seen as being a frivolous waste of money, because it's going to be things are going to be inefficient. It makes it harder to get at things for maintenance. Whereas having some locomotives that are streamlined and look fancy, even if it's only 5 or 10 out of a class of 40 or 50, it is it's a very effective sort of psychological thing of, look, we're continuing to push the cutting edge of this thing, even if it is a standard steam locomotive with a bit of fancy steel cladding bent round it. It gives a certain look and a certain sense of, we are going somewhere, we have speed and we have prestige with it, which sort of starts to fall after the Second World War, because there's not a lot of the entire country has been very much worn down and exhausted by the war, and it's just like, thank God this is all over.
Yeah. I would say part of what you're describing to me is what is wrong with, I guess the term might be leveling, is that that is a very much an element of socialism, but the idea of not striving for excellence in whatever, like you say, even if it's still just steam, basics, the same basic technology with only improvements around the edges, streamlining for better airflow efficiency, and maybe for aesthetics too. But you get rid of the idea of working for excellence, and that is a problem going on whenever you have a lot of the sort of, I don't know, working for the lowest common denominator that socialism often does. And yeah, I know this is a diatribe against socialism on my part, but I just see it as, for all the supposed good it's supposed to do, it just really does a lot more harm than any good. Well, on that note, I think we'll end this here. I want to thank you, IKB.
Thank you very much.
And so, even if you don't like this, you like what I say, but I hope it was interesting. And I hope you'll come back for more historical gaming videos. We'll be continuing this series at some point in the future, but we're going to be ending here. So thank you so much. See you next time for more historical gaming.